They say power corrupts, but I say rather that the already corrupt are attracted to power. Once in power, it's do as I say and not as I do. Half a millennium ago, the rich and powerful sought to buy their way out of purgatory while continuing to sin all they wanted. Now the rich and powerful assume their wealth entitles them to behave in exactly the same way. Here's the thing, it's not a revolution we need, because a revolution only serves those already powerful. What's required is that reformation. Martin Luther, he of the First Reformation, protested that every human being was responsible for him or herself, indeed had to expect to stand before God and give account of him or herself. It was no good looking to the church, to any institution for salvation. It was about taking and accepting personal responsibility. No one's coming to save us, quite the contrary. The only solution, the only salvation lies within each and every one of us. So stay awake, keep pointing out and calling out the liars. We won't comply our way out of tyranny. Stop swallowing all the crap, and I mean literally. It's simply time to look after ourselves, to take care of ourselves, because there's no cavalry coming. Stand up straight and stand strong. If the last few years have taught us anything, it's that the defiance of every individual does make a difference. The road we take next is not up to them, it's up to us. Andrew, a reformation rather than a revolution.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I think what we now need is sort of respect for fellow human beings. And the reality is, it's a lot of things is rather than being a penalty, as you say, for doing wrongdoing, it's a licence fee. And those who can afford to do the wrongdoing, pay that licence fee, can get away with it. So it's actually also an evolution rather than a revolution. I think the more that we can understand each other for humanity's sakes, that's got to be good. And what I find extraordinary, and we've just got the results of various elections coming out, the biggest winner was actually apathy. You look at the turnout in things like Blackpool, what was it, 32%? I think somewhere else it was like 22%. It means that people can't be bothered. So what does that tell us about the people at the moment? Why are they not engaged?
It feels as though we're living in parallel realities. The political class at all levels, from Westminster down, are going one way, and the mass of the population, it would appear, don't care where they go.
Yeah,
and yet they still wield ridiculous control over our lives.
I think you're absolutely right. I always say that trust comes in on foot and leaves on horseback. I think trust in politicians, in the media, in various other things, in the police, is at an all-time low. So how do we restore that trust? We need to look at those sort of issues.
Don't you think, you're right to invoke apathy, but I mean, don't you think that uncomfortable, onerous though it may be, it will come down to more of us taking on responsibility?
Yeah,
the decades of expecting that other people were going to make sure the lights came on and the rubbish was collected, they're over.
I think that's right, and we've had a heavy reliance on experts, and everybody suddenly, we just basically swallow whatever the expert, in inverted commas, says to us. Now that's very, very dangerous. So, and all of a sudden in this social media age, what's happened is everybody's an expert on everything, whether it's on the Constitution, whether it's on vaccines and so on and so forth. Everybody with an opinion espouses that opinion, however ill-founded. And I think it's more than ever we have to question everything. And what I always find extraordinary, whenever I come on your show with you, reading some of the comments on social media, well, you're not doctors, how can you comment on it? Well, all we're doing is questioning it. You have to question everything. Every question is legitimate, and as soon as we get experts who can't agree, we've got a problem.
That's absolutely right. That idea that we should just abdicate responsibility for everything is a slow death by 1,000 cuts. Yeah. We have to pay attention, read for ourselves, understand for ourselves. We've got to go into a break already, after which I'll be joined by German economist Professor Richard Werner to talk about the reality of money. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go away.
What happened first was March 2020, the central planners revved up money creation like crazy, and that caused the inflation 18 months later. As I warned at the time, when I saw the data, and by May 2020, I expected significant inflation because it was massive credit creation, forcing the banking system to massively expand credit creation and the central banks themselves as well. But of course, they're blaming it on this, external forces. And also they've been working to rearrange the international financial infrastructure, and they're looking for new anchors, so shifting from the petrodollar, which has ended because now Saudi Arabia is also selling oil against other currencies, the Chinese currency, because we know the BRICS economies are aligning And they've decided they don't want to use the US dollar. So it's very clear that there's more and more countries that are moving against the dollar, and that puts pressure on the system and accelerates the need to have a different anchor. And it looks like ideally what they'd like to do is have central bank digital currency, which is, it's less a currency, it's a control tool, and then they feel they're in charge again. So I think that's something, that's definitely one step too far, and we have to speak up and stop this now, because you know, there's no coming back from that one. If we give them central bank digital currency, programmable money, which is really potential money, you know, conditional money. Each time you want to use it, essentially you have to send a quick application, whether the central planner says yes or no to you at that spot in this geographic location for this particular purchase at that particular shop, buying that particular, say, book by that author. And if they don't like it, it's not going to happen. And you think they can't do that? Well, they'll use AI against us. You know, that's one of the key functions for the central planners, to have the tools to manage us. And of course, some people will get special personal treatment, you know, as we've seen with some people that get cancelled. So that's the current plan, I suppose, based on what they've told us.
Andrew Eborn, it's a terrifyingly confusing situation in which we find ourselves, is it not?
No, you're absolutely right.
This endless litany of not a litany, but this endless sequence of financial crises, each one of which seems to be rectified in favour of the bankers, and the rest of us are left floundering, wonder what just happened.
No, you're absolutely right. And as you said at the top of the show, what we do, we're so reliant on experts who hide behind jargon that we don't understand what's going on. And actually, banks have been dropped by most economists since the 1980s because they're only intermediaries. So you've got to look at, well, where does your money come from? And what's the reality on that sort of side? And what I love about this sort of explanation is get rid of the jargon, unpack it in a way that people can understand.
Professor Werner, I'm very mindful that most people, maybe perhaps especially the younger generations coming through, simply have no idea, nor could they have any idea of what money actually is, where it comes from, who creates it. If you could pull the levers, what would you insist that people understood about the reality of money?
Well, the fact that, for example, concerning central bank digital currencies, which is a bit of a misnomer to sell it to us. They're telling us, oh, it's new, it's central bank digital currency. We haven't had that. Actually, we've been using bank digital currency, BDC, for several decades because banks create money when they give a loan. And because of that power in the hands of the banks, and the banks, of course, are supervised by the central banks, it is important to have a decentralized banking system with many, many small banks. And countries that have achieved that, they perform much better. That's how China did it. They started out with the central planner's dream of one bank, the central bank, and no other banks, Soviet system. Then Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, and he wanted a system that works. And we know a decentralized system works much better and is actually much more resilient and delivers. So instead of 5 central planners at the central bank deciding who creates and how much money to create and who gets it and spending for what, he's created 5,000 banks with 24 branches each, with 24 loan officers giving loans to small firms. So now you've got 3 to 5 million loan officers, and they make the loan. And as long as they lend to business investment, for small firms for business investment, you get growth and no inflation. But in the West, the central planners, they've been jealous of the Soviet central planning system. They've been wanting to introduce that. I mean, the EU is such a structure, but also other central banks. And so they want to reduce the number of banks. In the UK, the problem is there's too few banks. What we need is small banks, because the big banks don't lend to small firms. And if you have many, many small banks, they lend to small firms. Then you get money creation on the ground by many small banks that lend to the local firms for local business expansion, job creation. It's much higher job creation and economic growth, not inflation and not asset bubbles and crises. It's when you have a centralized system like the UK, 5 big banks dominating banking. They don't want to lend to small firms. They want to do big deals with big customers. So they lend to the private equity funds, the hedge funds, financial speculation, property loans, real estate lending. That creates these boom-bust cycles and banking crisis. So what we need is we need to create many small banks. And in the UK, I've been working on that. We need to set up community banks. I think a lot of people would like that, to have a local bank, local headquarters, the bank managers locally being the ones that make the decision. And the regulators should look kindly on this, because a system like this is actually more resilient to shocks and crises, and it delivers for the country. And that's what the UK needs other countries also. Create local community banks.
Professor Werner, I love the sound of that. Local community banks. Also, you've reinforced my suspicion that central bank digital currencies are a solution without a problem. They're a solution to a problem that's not there. I wish I had more time. Please come back and give us more of your insight on this fascinating subject. Professor Richard Werner.
Thanks very much.
A break again, after which I'll be chatting to American tech entrepreneur Jennifer Arcuri about her take on cryptocurrencies and in particular the future or not of Bitcoin. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go anywhere.
I mean, even if you did continue this, you know, the mining and building out the proof of work, you know, this scalable consensus protocol that Bitcoin runs on is never going to be an optimal world currency. It's not going to be what people use on a daily basis. It's not a store of value because there's no value to it. It's a bunch of pump and dump.
Hold that thought, Jennifer Arcuri. Andrew Eborn, do you have FOMO? Do you have fear of missing out on Bitcoin, or are you glad that that ship sailed without?
I think as soon as I was hearing Jennifer speak, I think, and you were asking, well, what is this explanation for these crazy valuation? They are crazy. FOMO, fear of missing out, is what drove it, because people wanted to, they hear everybody say we're multimillionaires for doing nothing overnight. That sort of greed factor. But I think, as I always like to do, is break down the jargon, because a lot of people will be watching here and say, well, we don't really understand what is a Bitcoin. And I think whoever better than Jennifer just to explain in simple terms what it is.
Jennifer, just a quick, almost a yes or no answer. Do you think that Bitcoin was always brought in, was always going to be a trap? Or do you think there was an earlier period where it might have been something else entirely? Or was it simply created, as you say, as a Trojan horse or as a trap for the gullible?
Well, it was created after the last financial crisis. So I absolutely believe it was an exercise, a beta exercise to get people in. And ultimately, knowing that we are coming to the end of this life cycle of a fiat currency, you know, what better way to shovel the plebs into the paddocks of Bitcoin? You know, look over here while we do this. You know, there's nothing that's going to replace physical gold and silver. Centuries have shown us this. And as far as you know, what is Bitcoin? Well, everyone talks about it being this decentralized currency. That's actually a misconception. It's a software that is centralized under a foundation, and it determines if Bitcoin has needs improvement protocols known as BIPs, and they're adapted under this software. So the individuals make the changes to how this software works. And this goes back to the mining, because now that we've been mining 10, 15 years, the rewards are just not there. And it's too costly and expensive, the electronic overhead to run these mines. So there's really no point in running this. So this mathematical protocol, this, you know, equation that people are looking in as a store of value, this piece of digital gold, well, that's just not true.
Jennifer
Nothing
Arcuri,
is going to replace real gold.
I'll have to jump in there just because I've run out of time. And it's not decentralized. This is another myth, just wanting to make this clear.
I mean, it's becoming more and more centralized every day. We see this with the Bitcoin ETF. The minute they created that, they created a market to short, or a product to short in the market. And that's
Jennifer,
what we're seeing.
I just need to jump in, just purely because I'm running out of time. Once again, you have frightened me about Bitcoin. I go through highs and lows, but once again, you have put the fear of God into me concerning Bitcoin. Thank you, Jennifer Arcuri. After the break, I'll be debating whether the laws in this country governing assisted dying need to change. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go away. Andrew Eborn, you're a lawyer. You understand that this from a legal perspective also. How do we help doctors and patients walk the ethical tightrope between what seems decent and what might be illegal.
Sure, you're absolutely right. And under the Suicide Act 1961, just to be clear about this, assisted suicide is an offence. It's punishable by up to 14 years in prison. Peter's absolutely right. There's a quality of life. You're entitled to right to life, but also dignity in death. And I think what Andrew's talking about with respect is about the safeguards, if you like, to make sure those safeguards are in. What's currently before Parliament is you're putting those safeguards in. And I think that's what you need to look at. The people deserve a quality of basically being eased out of pain, if you like. And there's some of the terrible circumstances that we hear about, and Esther Ranson, to her credit, has spoken very publicly about that. What we need to do is make sure that you can get dignity for people so they don't have to go abroad, they don't have to be away from their loved ones, and they can have dignity in death as well as in life.
Well, first let me say that 84% of the public and the vast majority of doctors support the right of a person to choose the timing and manner of their death. They say that just as we all expect a quality of life, we should also be entitled to a quality of death, that no one should have to suffer agonizing pain for weeks and months and years, that if they choose, with supervision and with coordination, to end their own life, that should be their choice. Now, under the bill that's proposed, the assisted dying bill of Baroness Meacher, there are very strong safeguards. An assisted dying would have to be approved independently by 2 different doctors. It would have to be authorised by a High Court judge. The person would have to be aged 18 or older. They would have to be of sound mind and to have clearly wished and expressed this over a period of time of their own free will. And on top of that, they would have to have the diagnosis of a terminal illness and be expected to die within less than 6 months. So under no circumstances would this bill allow relatives to pressure family members. Under no circumstances would someone simply decide they want to end their own life. There are very, very strong safeguards, and this kind of legislation has worked well in New Zealand, Belgium, and 6 Australian states. So I understand the fears, but let's not scaremonger. There are protections. No vulnerable person could be bullied into agreeing to take their own life because of greedy relatives under this legislation. It's got the protections there.
Andrew Eborn, are you persuaded of the watertight case that Peter Tatchell makes?
Well, I
see
think
it as being beyond abuse.
No, I think there are a couple of points here. Is that obviously doctors absolutely have a fundamental obligation to do no harm, but also their obligation is to ease suffering. And what we're talking about here is sort of a dignified way to do it. The quotes that Andrew is talking about are horrendous. If people sitting at the bedside and waiting till granny dies so they can get the houses, of course that's appalling. What we're talking about, I think there is common ground here. We don't want people to suffer. What we want to do is to safeguard against the abuses. And the bill as it's currently going through, and as Peter eloquently put, they've got those safeguards in place. The other question, I've discussed this with you a number of times, is the seismic advances in medicine now mean that you can prolong life forever if you wanted to, and you can keep people alive. So the question comes along is, what is life? And it's about quality of life, not just quantity. And you need to look at that sort of side as well.
And Andrew Bridgen, you and I have talked in another context about bodily autonomy more than once in relation to the medical interventions that were offered and pushed as vaccines during COVID. And bodily autonomy seemed to be shouted down loudly, you know, people saying, my body, my choice. And yet here, this would very much seem to depend upon a person being able to claim bodily autonomy. Am I right in thinking there's a grayness there between, in the last 4 years, people were discouraged from considering that they had bodily autonomy, and that now those requesting assisted dying, you know, a main plank of it would be my body, my choice, and it's being honoured in one and not in the other.
Well, I think it's when it suits the state, the rules can change. I am very concerned that there was involuntary euthanasia during the first wave of COVID-19, and we've talked on your programme. You gave us the airtime to bring in concerned relatives around NICE guideline NG163 and the midazolam and morphine. And clearly, I think, you know, Matt Hancock has had some Damascene conversion, that he was always against assisted dying, but now he's suddenly for it. And I really do suspect people like his motives around this, when he's very clearly implicated in very serious questions about the potential euthanasia of tens of thousands of vulnerable elderly in early 2020.
Peter, how would you react to that? There certainly was conversation, and allegations have been made, and counterclaims, and and it's been refuted, and so on and so on. But there certainly was a time when people were saying, and they're still saying, that their relatives were shuffled off this mortal coil against their will and without the knowledge of the families, which serves to point up the potential danger when you invite the medical establishment to have that life and death power.
Well, that certainly was the case. And I know from my own experience, my own cousin had a decision taken by medical staff to withdraw food and water just hours before her sisters were due to arrive from Australia to her bedside. They effectively killed her just 5 hours before her sisters arrived. But that was not lawful. Well, put it this way, they got away with it, but, it wasn't lawful, and what happened during COVID wasn't lawful either. What we're now proposing is to set up a clear, lawful framework which would not allow anybody, either as a sick person themselves or relatives, to force something through without the oversight of 2 independent doctors and a High Court judge. No High Court judge is going to approve assisted dying without really strong evidence that someone has consented to it, that they have a terminal illness with less than 6 months to live, and that they have made this choice freely and consciously of their own free will. That's a very high bar. 2 independent doctors and a High Court judge.
Andrew Eborn, that is troubling.
Yeah.
What Peter Tatchell is saying, we've all heard these stories about people who were nudged out of the exit door, but against their will.
Absolutely, and these cases are horrendous, and these are abuse. And I go back to the point I was saying beforehand, is that you need to look at more light, less heat. So what I would ask Andrew, and from that point of view, is that in what circumstances would he support assisted dying, assuming that we deal with all the abuse cases and get rid of those? Are there any circumstances where he would support it?
Or what does he think are the flaws of the current bill, Baroness Meach's bill?
To you, Andrew Bridgen, I mean, are there circumstances? Is it a straight no to you? Is it a straight no from you, from the very idea of these amendments? Or are there circumstances under which?
I honestly think it devalues life as a whole, certainly for the individuals who have been asked to make that decision. I think it changes the complete ethos of the National Health Service, which I would, as I say, I'd never want it to be the National Death Service. And remember, in 2014, we debated and Parliament decided to outlaw the Liverpool care pathway, which was the death pathway that elderly people were put onto. We're having vulnerability scoring, frailty scoring now in hospitals, where the vulnerable elderly are scored. And if they score over a certain number of points, which may be 6, they're put onto the terminal life pathway, which is, again, refused nothing by mouth, effectively starved and to death, and put on end-of-life drugs. This is the same organisation that's going to do all the rules properly and administer the assisted dying.
But Andrew,
I'm afraid, gentlemen, I'm going to have to jump in only because we've run out of time. But thank you both very much for that. A very sensitive consideration of perhaps one of the, a subject more emotive. It would be hard to imagine. Peter Tatchell, Andrew Bridgen MP, thank you very much. We're on to a break now, and then a conversation with a professor of oncology who says he has seen a massive spike in cancer rates since the COVID-19 pandemic. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. My next guest tonight is Professor of Oncology Angus Dalgleish, who says he has seen and reports a massive rise in cancer rates since the COVID pandemic. The question is what he is seeing a result of the pandemic, or is it to do with the products that were offered as vaccines? Welcome to the show, Professor.
Yeah.
Can you explain in simple terms what it is that you are seeing that has got the alarm bells ringing?
Well, the first thing I saw doing a regular melanoma clinic that I've been doing for years was that I was starting to see people who were stable, that we've been doing immunotherapy for over 20 years. And I was starting to see people who've been stable for 5, 10, even 20 years relapse, really unusually. They're very fit and healthy. And I've occasionally seen this when somebody gets very depressed, they get knocked back, a bereavement, a divorce, bankruptcy for months. And we know this depression is associated with immune suppression. So I have seen that 2 or 3 times. And I looked for this in these patients, and there was absolutely no evidence. They were all perfectly happy. So I basically said, what have they all got in common? And they'd all got in common was they'd had the first booster vaccine. It was around this time. And I was able to show that they'd had it, then the relapse started between about 3 weeks and 3 months after the booster vaccine. So I thought this is an association. That doesn't mean to say it's causal. I mean, I'm the first to say that. But when you see an association, and that it might be actually inducing it, you have to first of all ask why. Scientifically, is there a rationale for this? And 2, is there anything else? Is it just a coincidence? Well, the thing that alarmed me was that I've done a lot of research on vaccines in my time, and I immediately remembered the model where 1 vaccine's good, 2 might help if the first one didn't react properly, but the 3rd actually causes just more inflammation than good, and actually detracts from the first 2. And the 4th is even worse. And I suddenly thought, is this what I'm seeing here? So we looked at the patients who'd been given their booster vaccine. There's a lot of research going on, and they were all just focused on the antibodies. I mean, the rationale for giving this booster vaccine was the antibodies from the first 2 are starting to wane. They need a boost. That was totally inane thinking, because the antibodies will always wane after an infection, after a vaccine, and then they will settle primed for when you do come across the virus. They're primed to rise up against it. You don't need to give it a big boost. And the other thing that was clear, they were boosting initially with exactly the same virus that they were attacking in the first place, which had left the planet over a year ago, 18 months ago. And we were now dealing with a totally different variant, the Omicron, which I actually personally think was the best vaccine we ever had, because it was airborne and very non-toxic.
What is it that, let's say that it's the booster, whatever was injected in the booster, what is it that it does to the body or to the immune system that would make that person more susceptible to the cancer that had otherwise been being held in abeyance?
Well, that's quite right. The immune system, it does hold the cancer in abeyance. We now know that very, very well. And we've known that when severe immune suppression is induced by some other source, like HIV, cancers appear, which would not normally have appeared. So what's happened with this booster, I mean, it's a powerful booster designed to induce as many antibodies as possibly can. And the immune system's only got limited resources, and it remains in an equilibrium balance. So you're suddenly using an enormous amount of these resources to make antibodies to throw at a virus that's not there and never will be. And we predicted that if there was a successful coronavirus vaccine, it would only be useful once, because you get this thing called immunological imprinting or antigenic sin. So even if you do put in a new variant, the immune system will only see the response to the first virus and the first vaccine. So the scenario is quite pointless, except by using all these resources, you actually take away from the T cells, and it's the T cells controlling the cancer. And then when I actually speculated this might be happening, I asked the people in the lab to look at it, and lo and behold, another group published that cancer patients who'd received a booster had T cell exhaustion. I mean, they couldn't have put it better.
And the T cells are policing, they're looking for cancer cells to arrest and detain.
It's a very good way of putting it. And they probably do it on a daily basis. I mean, we have normal cells rise every day. There's just millions, and it's very well controlled. And we know this, that patients who've had very bad cancer, we can give them the new immunotherapies now to boost their T-cell responses, and they can get complete responses and be under control for years. And so this is what was happening with the booster vaccine. It was perturbing this wonderful equilibrium of control and basically interrupting all the resources, and it led to a depression of the T-cell response. Now, I thought that was the most likely explanation, but I was amazed at how bad it was in some patients. As I said, they used T-cell exhaustion, not T-cell suppression, but exhaustion, that they'd just been stimulated to the point where they were no longer able to do their job. And then another paper came out showing that after the booster, not after the first and second induce what we call immunoglobulin subtypes. We call these 1 and 3, and these make neutralizing antibodies. But after the booster, many people now have reported that the subtype switches to 4. Now, what this means, instead of attacking a virus with a neutralizing killing, they switch off to a tolerizing one. And IgG4 is exactly the antibody response you want if you have a kidney transplant or a liver transplant. You want to tolerize the antibodies so they don't go and attack the new kidney or the renal. So all of a sudden this starts falling into place. My God, we're switching off the policeman and then we're tolerizing. And so no wonder the cancer is able to escape. But subsequently we found many other disturbing reasons why, at the very least, and my point has been that the fact that we have a scientific explanation for this, the fact that we are seeing this should be a red flag, and the MHRA should stop all the boosters. I mean, they've reduced it for people under 75, but if you're at risk, you can still get it. You can buy it at Boots, so there was an announcement. I mean, all this is absolutely nonsense for a virus that has long since gone.
Also joining this conversation is Dr. David Strain, Associate Professor of Cardiometabolic Health at the University of Exeter Medical School. Doctor, we've spoken before in relation to the vaccine rollout. I'd be very interested to hear your take on oncology Professor Angus Dalglish's assertion that cancer's on the rise because of, or possibly because of, the vaccine rollout of the booster.
It's a really interesting story, and I have been following Professor Dalglish's theories behind this. You've got to be aware that the mRNA vaccines, these ones that we're using for the boosters at the moment, they've actually originally been developed for treating cancers, for looking towards cancer. And whereas every single piece in Professor Dalglish's story actually makes sense, the one thing that's missing is any evidence that you do see this T-cell exhaustion. Indeed, the actual natural killer T-cells, the ones that are most involved in cancer, are heightened by the vaccination across a whole group of people. And it's suppression of that NKT cells that is leading to conditions such as long COVID and other post-viral illnesses. It's also interesting that he's completely skirted the fact that the virus itself is oncogenic. The virus itself, like many other viruses, has got demonstrated that it reduces one of our protective things, P53 and sirtuin-5. These are two things that are supposed to guide those T cells towards the cancerous cells. And the virus, COVID itself, all variants, including the Omicron variant, have been linked with suppression of P53 and suppression of SIRT5. And the difference between that and Professor Dalglish's story is that has actually been demonstrated. It's been very clearly demonstrated in mouse models and human tissue culture that this virus will suppress the things that are supposed to protect us, are supposed to do that. So, you know, it's a great theory, and it does need exploring. I'm not in any way saying that we should discount it. I'm not in any way saying that vaccines are 100% safe. What I'm saying is that the evidence is lacking that there is any suppression of the T cells from the
Dr.
vaccine.
Strain, let me address that directly to Professor Dalgleish. I very often hear this split between those who say the problem is caused by the vaccine products, but no, the problem is caused by the virus itself. And here again, there seems to be a plank of Dr. Strain's argument. So how do you respond to the suggestion that it's not the vaccine, that it's the COVID virus?
Well, the first thing I'd like to correct is one major error. There's been massive publications showing T-cell suppression, T-cell exhaustion from other centres now, and there's been several publications that are published, peer-reviewed, and it's accepted, and indeed my own lab have confirmed this. So, I mean, you can't say things which are just blatantly not true. The second thing is, whatever the virus does, it is out of the system within about 20 days, and so it doesn't have that much time to do the various links, and we mentioned about P53, etc. That's something that usually takes quite a long time to interfere with before you would get any outcome. We're talking about the messenger RNA from the vaccine. That doesn't last 20 days. It's 9 months and counting. So it's got plenty of time to induce all sorts of chaos that the virus never would. You either get rid of it, you get long COVID, or you die from it. What we're seeing now is that the COVID boosters, they are all messenger RNA, and the ones that I'm aware of being given. The AstraZeneca was quietly withdrawn when the clotting issue became recognised, but nothing was done about that. So that's my argument, is that the vaccine, we cannot control it, and I get often accused of, I'm just a clinician, I don't know very much about these vaccine things, but I was on the board of a messenger RNA company for 5 years, and I left 7 years ago. I know a hell of a lot about these vaccines, and they are being used for cancer. They were trying to develop them for cancer, but they always couldn't get past the block of safety issues. And yet we've used the pandemic to get rid of all those concerns, push them through, and now we're dealing with exactly why those of us who were involved with safety and these other issues were very concerned, and why they didn't get approved over the last 12 years I've been involved in it, because of the safety issues. Just to make it easier for the viewers, to get a virus vaccine from messenger RNA, if you just do the messenger RNA and use that as a vaccine, it's dissolved in 20 seconds. I mean, so you have to stabilise it, and there lies the problem. You have to put it in the nanolipids vehicles, and you have to put in an insert into it to stop it being gobbled up within 20 seconds. Unfortunately, that insert, we can't control it, which is why we can identify it 9 months later, and I have colleagues who have identified, because the virus is different from the vaccine RNA, you can identify that messenger RNA in tumours that it has caused. You can actually identify it in tumours, and there are many publications on that.
Dr. Strain, it does sound. How do you respond to the suggestion? Were you unaware of the peer-reviewed publications to which the professor refers? Because it does sound as though there are plenty of examples out there published of T-cell suppression.
So there are two different issues there. So firstly, going through the fact that a virus doesn't cause cancer, that's utter nonsense. We know human papillomavirus, we knew hepatitis B and C virus, all of the herpes virus actually can cause cancer. Epstein-Barr virus is a great example of that, which is causing many tumours around the world even today. And that's the virus that we get that causes glandular fever in some people hangs around. So suggest that a virus doesn't cause this is utter nonsense. Now, I am aware of T-cell suppression as a concept. I have not seen any papers that suggest that a booster vaccine will cause T-cell suppression, and I would love Professor Dalgleish to send them across to me, because I would actually like to read them. The other bit that he talks about with this, the pseudopurine, or one of the ingredients that hides the mRNA from your own T cells, and that has been demonstrated. I can only agree with him that if you give mRNA without any sorts of modification, it will get gobbled up very, very quickly. And there is a slight modification to one of the bases that goes in it that will hide that mRNA string from the T cells. Now, it doesn't suppress the T cells, it just hides it. It's like wearing a disguise. And that is an ingredient that the body will not just throw away. It will continue to use. So, yes, it will be found around the body. I am still fail to be convinced that having a molecule that we've inserted that you can get in foodstuffs, you can get all over the place, having a molecule that we've inserted into a vaccine is the cause of a cancer just because it is there at the same time. But like Professor Dalgleish, I would love to see some more research on that going forwards.
Can I ask you, Dr. Strain, isn't it, when there's a doubt like this, now you've said yourself, that there are possibilities and you're interested in the evidence that Professor Dalgleish is quoting and stating. Given that this is a product that has been made available to billions of people, and there are so many questions around it, why so determined to continue to have that product out there? Wouldn't it simply be safer to withdraw it completely, as the professor and others suggest, subject to wholesale investigation of the whole project? Why are you so determined to defend it when you accept that there's doubt?
So any new medical innovation, there will be doubt. There is always going to be doubt. We just have to put this into context. As you say, this has been given to billions of people, literally billions of people. It has saved millions of lives. Without this vaccine, we wouldn't be able to sit in studios together. We wouldn't be able to socialize in the same way it has. If there was a tremendous increase in cancers that we'd have seen, we would have started to see it by now. And actually, the small increase in cancers that we've seen in the registries coming through recently is entirely accountable for by the fact that for 2 years we were locked down, we weren't getting our safety checks. So we were bound to get more cancers in an aging population as you come out of a pandemic, because cancers that have been left are now coming to light.
Hold on there, Dr. Strain.
People, yeah.
Hold on there, Professor. There's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot of information.
Lots of information.
I just simply have to let you respond. I mean, before I do, I would say that line about millions of lives saved, is that based on any real-world data? Or, as I've always understood, it's based on a single paper by Asragani, published in The Lancet or the BMJ, I think. Yeah. And it was all based on mathematical modelling. There was no actual real-world data involved.
I seriously doubt whether the vaccine programme saved any more than a handful of lives. And I really mean it. I've looked into this very, very difficult. The vaccine was introduced too late for the virus variant that it was. And when you really look at the data very strongly, you'll find that after the vaccine, there was more COVID in the second waves. And we now know that after the booster, you're 3.5 times more likely to get COVID than if you didn't have the booster. So that's another real-world example of a suppression. I'd like to take issue about viruses and cancer. I mean, I have written books on viruses and cancer, so I know all about the oncogenic viruses. The coronavirus is not an oncogenic virus. It is only capable of being an oncogenic virus if you stabilise that RNA, and then that can interfere with the genes that unlock and unleash effects. So I really take issue with that. That's got nothing to do with it. And I really do take issue that the vaccine programme has saved anything significant. And I made a statement that I do believe now that the vaccines have probably killed more people than they've ever saved. Forget the cancer. I mean, the heart attacks, the myocarditis, the strokes, the neurological problems. They're enormous. And I'm just saying, hey, I'm starting to see the cancer thing. You asked me how I got into it, but subsequently then, I'm seeing loads of patients who have gone down, and my even friends vaccines. And when I actually published that I'd seen this, and my reason for doing it is to say to the MHRA and to the NHS, whoa, there's something here, we don't need it, stop it. But they have totally ignored it. But interestingly, I've been contacted by colleagues all around the world, from Australia, South Africa, Canada, USA, have all called me up, emailed me. We see exactly the same as you. They say, we see it's exactly the same.
Dr. Strain, what evidence do you have about the vaccine having saved millions of lives? And I'm offering that so that you can, so that you can respond in real time to Professor Dalgleish, saying that and going on the record saying that the vaccines have killed more people than they've saved. What real-world data can you provide that would counter that and back up your statement that they saved millions of lives?
So the real world data has rapidly accumulated, just looking at countries that implemented vaccination strategy versus those who haven't done it. I mean, even today, the mortality from COVID in Republican states in America is 5% higher, absolute numbers, than in the Democratic states. So in the states that are Trump supporters, anti-vaxxers, they have more chance of dying of COVID for any other risk factor. The statement that you're more likely to catch COVID if you're vaccinated, strictly speaking, actually is true, and that's just looking at non-comparable data. Because if you think about people who have had the boosters, think about people who are more likely to continue to get boosters, they are the people who are far more likely to die. And if you've got a tenfold increased risk of dying of COVID, and then you're vaccinated, and even if it halves the risk of you dying of COVID, you're still going to have a fivefold increased risk of dying of COVID because you started off at a much higher rate, and that's been reduced. When you start looking at the comparative figures of countries that rolled out the vaccine program very quickly versus those that didn't. So even across Europe, the mortality from COVID was much higher in Portugal, that was late to roll out the system, than it was here in England, where we were one of the first in the world to roll it out. And those sorts of numbers have been very well reported all over the place.
OK, I'm going to have to go to a break at the moment, but we can pick this conversation up thereafter. Please stay with us both. Dr. David Strain, Professor Angus Dalgleish. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show, where we're continuing to consider the suggestion, the well-evidenced suggestion by oncology Professor Angus Dalgleish that there's been a very marked spike in the incidence of cancer in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. Professor Dalgleish, it's a very complicated conversation to listen to for the uninitiated. But it strikes me again and again, it comes back to the fact that we were told going in that the vaccines were safe and effective. And I don't think there's any denying, is there, that the word safe should never have been used, given the information that was already available to the authorities and from the pharmaceutical companies before a single needle had been put into a single arm. And as for effective, the suggestion which underpinned all of the propaganda that you were taking these products not for yourself, or not only for yourself, but to protect the community, when all those concerned in authority and the pharmaceutical companies knew that they had not even been asked to test if those products would prevent transmission from person to person. So neither safe nor effective. And it bemuses me why, after 4 years, those products are still out there being pushed into people's bodies.
Well, I personally think it's bordering on criminal negligence, to be quite honest, because we're discussing, is there a link between the vaccines and the cancer? It's now very clear there's a massive link between the increase of the vaccines and cardiovascular deaths, clots, everything. And we've known that for a long time. The CDC in America have known it, but they and the other regulatory authorities have been paralysed into doing nothing. And people like me who speak up, they do everything they can to silence, threaten, report, court-martial, the various things that they have. But as a doctor, my first duty is first do no harm. So when I suspect that some totally unnecessary, useless agent, that's, as you quite rightly say, there's no evidence whatsoever they ever protected transmission. That was just a myth. And the way they've used the data is just appalling. When they actually got the regulators to sign up for this, they said Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, 95% effective, 94% effective. This was the biggest smoke and mirrors going, because they were quoting relative risk. If you'd actually looked at absolute risk, the figures then were 0.84. Now, I'm not a statistician or a mathematician, I'm a real pragmatist, practical face. I want to know how many people do I need to vaccinate before even on those figures you're going to prevent one infection? That figure was 118. Now, I would know that it was a total waste of time going ahead with them, and they had fiddled the figures. Every paper trying to make out the vaccines were good or effective or did some use or save millions. It's all done on modelling and selected, highly selected data, which, I mean, I've really lost my faith in the journals. I mean, when I was the first to pick up that the virus had escaped from the lab because it had 6 insertions around it, we thought, they need to know this. It's important, because if you don't take notice of that, you'll end up with a bad vaccine. We submitted it and it went to Cabinet, and everybody witty, they've all seen it, so they can't deny it, what have you, but they chose to ignore it. And then we sent it to Nature, Science, Virology, Lancet, and we got the same reply back. Really eerie. It said, we've nothing against the science, but it is not in the public interest to publish your paper.
Andrew Eborn, not in the public interest to publish a paper like that.
I'm sitting here horrified, is the honest answer. We started the show talking about how dependent we are on experts, and we pointed out, no, we're not experts, we're not doctors. We now have 2 experts in their field. A professor of oncology saying these things is really, really horrifying. There's a couple of things. I mean, it's, as you highlighted before, and there's causation versus correlation. But questions of fact, it's all about evidence. And I think there's some fundamental things, because you then get, let's see the evidence first, and then let's have opinions on that evidence. But there seems to be a dispute about the evidence. You talk about the T things, and our guest who's not in the studio at the moment, but whether or not he's asked for the evidence, we can present that. So at least accept there is that evidence, because he's saying there isn't. The other thing is the suggestion that viruses cause cancer. And you're saying categorically that that's not the case. Is that right?
That many viruses cause cancer, and he named them off, but there's nothing to do with the coronaviruses. Right. Coronaviruses as a group do not cause cancer. It is possible that if they are interfered with and they last months and months, they could, and we do know mechanisms they could, but there's no way that coronavirus infection would ever cause cancer. Any perturbation of the immune system is transient. As I said, the virus only lasts a maximum of 20 days. It's very well measured, 12 to 20 days, whereas the messenger RNA from the vaccine is being produced 9 months down the line in your body. And there it is a totally different animal. It's got plenty of...
So two quick things then, probably to both of you, if I may, is that why do you think your colleagues and others within the industry, the medical profession, are disagreeing with what you're saying?
It is unbelievable. I mean, I've just co-authored a book which sums it up. And in the end of the day, we're trying to work out the title, and we summed up what we were documenting, the death of science. Talk about follow the science. They were never interested in the science. They should have called me in about that and say, where's the evidence for these things? Because we were able to translate it. Molecular biologists go, oh, it could be a random mutation, this, that and the other. No, this wasn't. And the journal that published it in the end was a biophysics one. So it understood the point we were making, that it altered the charge and the whole infectivity. And this would never, ever occur in normal evolution, because once it got to one stage, it would be kicked out. It would never get to the point where it was so highly charged. And we discussed this, put it all out there, and nobody wanted to enter any discussion. The thing about, I published another paper, apart from this one, on the history of coronaviruses and the vaccines, vaccination for them. Been going over 20 20 years, and they're very, very important. And we'd love to have effective vaccines for coronavirus in animals. And when you actually review, the reason we don't have an effective virus for coronavirus, which includes the cold, is because I mentioned it earlier on, it is once they've seen one, they find it very difficult to do anything about any minor variation. Right. So they make lots of useless antibodies, and it actually enhances infection of other antibodies. So nobody wanted to open up and discuss that, and it was all the literature. Fortunately, the editors and peer review saw nothing wrong with what we were saying, because we weren't actually challenging the vaccine.
So in the interest of balance...
Let me just bring in Dr. Strain. It does feel like mounting evidence, Dr. Strain. You know, as I said to Professor Dalgleish, there's no way you can still say safe and effective. You know, we know about the myocarditis, we know about the blood clotting. Professor Dalgleish is making, you know, is talking about a connection to a spike in cancer rates. And yet the population were pushed to take them on the grounds that they were safe and effective. And they were demonstrable untruths. Now, more and more evidence comes out all of the time. Why is it in your interests to defend what sounds like the indefensible? Why not just take the step of, in the interests of public safety, let's put the brakes on these products altogether? Why hang on to them in the face of all of this mounting evidence and doubt? I don't understand.
So, I mean, the term safe is something that actually, if I'm ever doing any work with any sorts of pharmaceutical industry, it's a word that I'm absolutely refuse to use. And it doesn't matter who it is that's going for it, because nothing is completely safe. And that doesn't just account for drugs and vaccines. That's everything from your Big Mac and fries through to crossing the street. Nothing should ever be touted as 100% safe. And what we've got here is a safety of a risk to benefit ratio. And yes, there have been a few highlighted problems. I mean, the myocarditis, significant issue for a very...
What benefit? What benefit? It doesn't stop transmission. It doesn't stop transmission. The very definition of vaccine had to be changed. A vaccine, as we've all understood it, was an injection that you took, or it was delivered into your body in some way, and it stopped you contracting the disease. But this product doesn't even do that. It stops you dying
of the disease. It stops you dying of the disease. I mean, let's be absolutely clear.
Vaccine. So even the very definition of vaccine had to be altered in order to keep these things on the market. I mean, why defend something with so many shadows over it? I don't understand why you wouldn't just advocate its withdrawal until we know more.
So at the moment, there is a very small select population that are still being offered vaccines. And for those particular people, the benefit of vaccination still outweighs the risk. We still have very, very small numbers of people dying of COVID. Fortunately, nothing like the numbers that we were getting before we rolled out this vaccination program. Remember, they were literally in a position that we were having to make decisions about whether somebody would be getting oxygen supply or whether they were going to be allowed to drown in their secretions. Now, that is not a decision we've had to make since the vaccine. The key role of the vaccine has always been to reduce hospitalizations, to reduce death and dependency and the bits that go with it.
It wasn't.
The secondary concern is the risk. The secondary concern is the risk of ongoing long-term problems. It was demonstrated very clearly here in the Office of National Statistics, and that's been replicated in several countries, that vaccinations reduces the risk of long COVID. Remember, there's 2.1 million people that are currently still affected by their COVID weeks, months, years after their initial infection, and the vaccine reduced the risk of that. Yes, I am not denying that the AstraZeneca vaccine caused blood clots. That's part of the mechanism of the adenoviral vector. We didn't know it at the time. That was a vaccine that was actually already pretty much being developed for many other purposes, including malaria that it's being used for now, and it did cause problems there. We saw the mRNA vaccines causing myocarditis, and it has caused problems there. We don't yet know whether that's the mRNA part of it, the mRNA component of vaccine, or whether it's the spike protein that it was generating that was causing that myocarditis. But for that reason, we are not giving boosters to people under the age of 30 unless they have major illnesses that means that they would benefit it. It's all about the risk benefit, and I'm not saying we go back to everybody should be vaccinated, because nobody's going to defend that, but there are still a small select population who've got a significant risk of dying of COVID today, and the mRNA vaccine is the best route to keep them out of hospital.
How you can say that it was always and only supposed to, minimise the impact of the disease, when it was absolutely, those products were pushed as safe and effective, and if you took it, it was going to halt the spread of COVID-19 in its tracks. And the fact that your memory of that has become, well, it was only ever supposed to keep you out of hospital. I just don't get it. But Professor Dalgleish, how would you seek to sum up the last 4 years of the presence in our lives of these medical products?
It's very, very hard to sum it up. It is incredibly difficult to have any scientific justification for it. And my goodness, I've had tsunamis of abuse about things like it's been proven, this paper shows that. And then we've gone to a lot of basic data, like Norman Fenton, who's a colleague, has gone through so many of the statistics, and they conclude what they do not show. I mean, one very important one is the VAERS data from Pfizer, which they tried to hide, and they actually presented it as being a very good safety record. But when you looked at that data, and it was only seen the light of day because of a US Supreme Judge, and when we actually looked at it, it was very clear. If you had an adverse event from the Pfizer vaccine, you had a 3% chance of dying. And this was in an era where if you caught the virus, you had a 0.08% chance of dying. At that point, it should have been killed. But no, something was going on here. The science was killed. There was no science. Politicians just reiterated. A number of politicians, Sunak says the same, safe and effective. They've got no idea what they're talking. There's just a mantra that's been going on, but it's been worldwide. My colleagues all over have been suffering from this. I'll
leave you to sum it up for us, Andrew. I mean, why are we still in this situation of listening to the defence of these products, which it seems to me the balance of evidence suggests that at the very least, well, they should be withdrawn from further notice.
It's absolutely crazy. And the frustration, as we say, is that we are not experts, so we're so dependent on the experts. My concern is about the evidence. And when Dr. Strain says he hasn't seen all the evidence, obviously that can be shared. If evidence is being suppressed, then we absolutely need to know about that. And also we need to know if data is being questioned, because it's one thing to say there's the data there. Are they disputing the fact that there is this data, or are they disputing the fact that it has the results that you say it has?
It's basically, as I say, it's a death of science, is that the conclusion has been reached a long time ago, and all data must fit into it, otherwise it's misinformation or it's bad science. This is what I've been living through, and I only now realise just the extent of the stitch-up. I mean, it's gone all the way from Fauci down to, he did Farrar and Vallance, made them go along with it while we suffered in the UK. It was because there was kind of a worldwide plan to lock everybody down, not only literally, but then to having the vaccine. And more importantly for me as a doctor, not to have to give other things which we know are very good for respiratory agents and which could have totally reduced the need for the vaccine. He wouldn't allow us to use them.
This is a subject which obviously will continue to give some of us high temperatures for the foreseeable future, virus or no virus. I've run out of time. That's all from me for this week. Thank you so much to my guests, to Dr. David Strain, Andrew Eborn, as always, Professor Angus Dalgleish. Thank you so much for your insights. You've been watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. See you for more next week.